Question number 17 on the reading portion of College Board's Test 5. In passage 2, Grimke makes which point about human rights? So Grimke has to make a certain point about human rights. Recall and realize that 17 is connected to 18. 18, you have to find the quotes to answer for 17. So let's take a look at 17 though. Let's see what answers seem reasonable or not based on what we remember from the passage. But as always, the answer to 17 is going to be answered in the quotes for 18. In passage 2, Grimke makes which point about human rights? A, they are viewed differently in various cultures. What? Doesn't she say with human rights that human beings have rights because there are more beings? These rights may be wrestled from the slave, they may be suppressed, they may be muted in certain populations, but his title to himself, the person who doesn't have rights being, I guess, expressed or shown, they have the same amount of rights or number of rights or that same essence of being right as that of Lyman Beecher, of a white pastor. It is stamped, your human rights are stamped on your moral being and imperishable. It will never go away, it will never decay, it will never rot. It is just as true for a free white man as it is for a enslaved African American. So we have, in this case, I think that she just makes the point that they are imperishable. They exist everywhere. They are always there for someone, whether or not society chooses to acknowledge them or not. Grimke makes which point about human rights? They are viewed differently in various cultures around the world. Maybe implicitly you can imply that, and that might be true, because you're like, yeah, how is that? That's irrefutable, George. There are different countries in the world, and they view human rights differently. How could you possibly say that that's not true? Yes, okay, I agree. Yeah, there are different countries and different time periods around the world where human rights are viewed differently. However, is this what Grimke says? Does she say, yeah, and what's the deal about all these other countries having different human rights than us? That's bad. She doesn't talk about that. We're not talking about other countries. We're just talking about America, I think, here. Or we're talking about, in an abstracted form, what is a human right and who has rights, and therefore what should women do about this issue of abolitionism. So this is, again, the College Board is taking us down a path that we don't want to go by having to accept and agree with this statement when in reality it was never stated anywhere in the passage. What about B? Grimke makes which point about human rights? They retain their moral authority regardless of whether or not they are recognized by law. I like that. I like that a lot, even though it seems very confusing at first. If you read that, I understand if you read it and glazed over, you're like, I have no idea what that means. Nonetheless, that's not a reason for getting rid of it. So don't read that, have no idea what's going on, and be like, well, out of sight, out of mind. Let me just cross it off. That's very bad. If you don't understand what a answer choice says, leave it and move on. Get rid of other answer choices. But you only get rid of answer choices because you know they're wrong, not because you are afraid of them. So let's go back to B, because B probably for most of you was like this confusing, like, I don't know, I'm confused maybe, let's leave it. What about C? They are sometimes at odds with moral responsibilities. This seems like a good settle answer. Like you were confused, and now C is just a little bit easier vocabulary to understand, and then it sounds like an English class answer. It sounds like something that someone that you think is smart would say, even though no one understands what they mean. They're sometimes at odds with moral responsibilities. What are moral responsibilities? Like moral responsibilities, like you help an old lady cross the street, you give back, change that falls out of someone's pocket. Like what's a moral? You don't steal. I don't know what that means. Human rights are at odds with moral responsibilities. I don't think that would make any sense. I think if anything, human rights always align with moral responsibilities, but let's not get philosophical here. I don't even know. C is a good bad answer. This is you picked it because you wanted to sound smart answer. D, they've become more advanced and refined throughout history. That might be true. It might be true, and you might look at history and say, yeah, human rights have improved historically. Okay. But does Grimke ever say that? Does she say, well, if we look historically, human rights have always gotten better, so, let's just coast on this upward trajectory? No. Just because that D is objectively true does not mean that it answers the question being asked. And that's like a very important thing that some people have to get across. An answer choice cannot be true in isolation. It always needs to be true when answering a particular question that's being asked. And in this case, we care about Grimke makes which point about human rights? They become more advanced? No, she never says that. I think the answer is going to be B. C is like a really confusing answer, but it's one of those things I can't get rid of out of hand because maybe she says something that human rights are sometimes at odds with certain responsibilities. Maybe there's some subtlety that I missed. Let's take a look at the quotes for number 18 in order to be definitive, but I think the answer for number 17 is going to be B. Question number 18 on the reading portion of College Board's Test 5. So 18 is a quote question and it references back to 17. We got rid of A and D in 17. I think the answer is going to be B for 17, but I couldn't necessarily get rid of C because there was something about it that it's like, okay, I can't necessarily get rid of it out of hand. I want to have some options. Maybe I'm wrong. So forget about that though. Forget about all of our pontificating on these answer choices. Let's answer the question being asked, which is, Grimke makes which point about human rights? What does Grimke say about human rights? What does Grimke say about human rights? Repeat that over and over in your head before and after you read these quotes. And you have to ask yourself, does this quote answer that question? It's 58 to 61. What does she say about human rights? Human beings have rights because they are moral beings. The rights of all men grow out of their moral nature. And as all men have the same moral nature, they have essentially the same rights. So what does Grimke believe about human rights? Everyone has the same rights. Okay. Let's look at B and C. They retain their moral authority regardless of whether or not they are recognized by law. That doesn't say anything about the law. It doesn't say anything about... I feel like that's A's. I'm going to leave A. Because it talks about Grimke and what she believes human rights, about human rights. They are sometimes at odds with moral responsibilities. That also doesn't answer that either for A, for 18. But let's take a look at B. We need to answer, is this point Grimke makes about human rights, 61 to 65. The rights may be wrestled from the slave, but they cannot be alienated. His title to himself, the slave's title, is as perfect now as that of Lyman Beecher, Catherine Beecher's father. It is stamped on his moral being and is, like it, imperishable. Like the moral, human rights are imperishable. They can never decay or rot. Maybe. That seems like actually a better understanding of what exactly is at issue here than A is. I feel like A for 18 was just stating facts. She was stating the groundwork for her argument. She's saying all humans have rights and they're all moral beings, therefore they all have the same rights. It's like, okay. But then the next quote, 61 to 65 for B says, whether or not you're a slave or whether or not you're a free white man, everyone has the same inalienable rights. They are true to the person regardless of where you are in that strata of inequality. So I kind of like on how B matches up with B for number 17 because Grimke says human rights retain their moral authority. They are, quote, imperishable regardless of whether they are recognized by law. The whole slave thing, right? Whether or not you're a slave or a free person, your title to yourself is they're identical. Whether, and I guess this is implied, whether or not society chooses to accept that, that's a whole nother issue. This is a very hard question, actually. I think B is going to match up with B for 17, but let's read the other quotes. And I'm not liking A again for 18 because I feel like it's a little bit too, it just states stuff, but it doesn't actually state a position or a belief. Besides the fact that human beings have all rights. And I don't think that's being debated here. That's not being argued. Let's take a look at 71 and 76. Does this answer the question about what Grimke makes what point about human rights? To suppose that it does. Remember, it refers to that men have a higher rights and responsibilities than women. To suppose that men have a higher right and responsibility than women would be to break up utterly the relations of the two natures, and to reverse their functions, exalting the animal nature into a monarch. Okay, so this is to suppose that men are superior to women would be to break up the relations and fabric of our society and make us no better than proprietors and property. So Grimke makes which point about human rights? That if we believe that one person is superior to another, then things fall apart. I don't understand how C for 18 matches any of the answer choices for 17. I don't think, again, C for 17 is an answer that just doesn't make any sense. She never once says that human rights are at odds with moral responsibilities or moral rights. She says that they're almost like identical or interchangeable. So I'd actually argue C is in a way logically impossible. C for 18 doesn't really make any sense here, especially in connection with any of the answer choices. This is a tough question because it seems like all these these quotes are talking about human rights, but we need to identify what is the crux or the issue of human rights that Grimke really believes, which is, I think, that all humans have these rights, regardless of whether or not we choose to acknowledge them. The slave versus Lyman Beecher, that whole comparison. What about 77 to 81? Does this say what Grimke believes about human rights? 77 to 81. When human beings are regarded as moral beings, sex, instead of being enthroned upon the summit, administering on the rights of responsibility, sinks into insignificance and nothingness. So Grimke makes one point about human rights, that they are... is that talking about human rights? Rights and responsibilities sink into significance? I don't think she says that human rights sink into insignificance. I think she says that sex sinks into significance. But that actually doesn't say anything about what her beliefs about human rights are. This is a very hard question. And I think the answer for number 18 is going to be B. And I think the answer number 17 is going to be B. We're going to have to hit on our understanding of what this is saying. Grimke says what? What's her central point? That human rights are inalienable. They exist in all people, regardless of whether or not we choose to acknowledge them. Because she says the rights of a slave are no different than the rights of a free man. The only difference between those rights that are metaphorically in the person, the rights that are imperishable, the ones that are stamped on every human being's moral being, is whether or not society in this case chooses to say, oh, you're a slave and you're not a slave. But she's saying the rights are wrestled, but they are not alienated. In other words, they are inalienable, to quote Thomas Jefferson. So, what does she make about human rights? They retain their moral authority. They are true and right and just, regardless of whether or not they are recognized by law, regardless of whether or not we treat a person a certain way. It doesn't necessarily mean that they don't have it. And that nicely matches up with answer choice B for 18. A for number 18, 58 to 61, that is just listing out, I think, the prerequisites for understanding why it matters that everyone has these rights, which is, I think, further elaborated on in 61 to 65. Just saying that human beings have rights and the rights of all men grow out of their moral nature and, they have the same rights, that doesn't actually say anything about... That doesn't really say much of anything. And I think that the conclusion of the argument happens in this orange portion in 61 to 65, because it answers that question of, who has rights? All men have rights, regardless of whether or not society chooses to see those rights. So the answer, again, number 18 is going to be B, and the answer to number 17 that matches up with that is going to be B as well. That's the main takeaway. It's very easy in a question like this to get lost in the weeds, but it's, I think, very important to zoom out a little bit and just get some perspective to remember what is it that this person is actually talking about. And we have to realize she's talking about the fact that that everyone has rights if they're human, and they're all the same. But man, male or female, if you're a slave or free, the only difference is how we choose to see them, not the fact that they don't exist. So the answer number 17 again is going to be B. Answer number 18 is going to match up with that, B.